You can also watch Book TV's coverage of FreedomFest 2011 online at booktv.org. But first, here is Don Luskin on his book I Am John Galt, which profiles people who symbolize characters, both heroes and villains, in Ayn Rand's novels.
Thank you for that great introduction. There is one substantial inaccuracy. I actually am John Galt. But you all are too. And that's the secret of Ayn Rand's enduring popularity. Her books are lessons. Her books are self-help books. Her books are guides to how to live. We can all be John Galt. We can all be heroes. Just read what's in there carefully. My new book, I Am John Galt, is a reader's guide to Atlas Shrugged and the Fountainhead to help you learn to live like an Ayn Rand hero, and at the same time to teach you what happens in the world when there are Ayn Rand-type villains out there. Now, I assume that everyone in this room has probably heard of Ayn Rand. How many people here have read the Atlas Shrugged? I'm actually stunned to not see every single hand in the room go up. Okay, here we got two big thumbs up for the virtue of selfishness here. Fantastic. Okay. If you haven't read Atlas Shrugged, in a way I envy you because you have before you a fantastic treat. The first reading of Atlas Shrugged is a transformative experience. In poll after poll, when Americans are asked, what is the book that influences you the most? Atlas Shrugged is always in the top 2 or 3. The Fountainhead, Ayn Rand's other masterpiece, is also always in the top 2 or 3. I got to tell you, there's a message in that. It is that we libertarians, we individualists, one of the curses of being an individualist is we tend to sometimes think that we're alone. I can tell you, I certainly feel that way. I live in Northern California, where a libertarian can feel very, very alone. I live just south of San Francisco, so I'm not literally in Nancy Pelosi's congressional district, but I can smell it from where I live. And I tell you, I can feel very alone. So it is fantastic to be here at FreedomFest. I thank Mark Skousen for hawking me for years to come here. It's great to see that there are like-minded people. They just don't happen to live in my zip code. So back to Ayn Rand. Atlas Shrugged was written 54 years ago. It is probably the best-selling book in the English language, which is an amazing thing. It sells more copies every year. It sold more copies last year than ever before in its history, and when it first came out in 1957, it was a bestseller then. Now, there's a narrative about that that's being promoted by the conservative community, and we all know that's different than the libertarian community, saying that the reason Ayn Rand is suddenly having this surge in popularity is because Atlas Shrugged portrays a world that is eerily like our world. So for those of you who haven't read it, let me just tell you what that world is. It is a world of decay, of economic collapse, of corruption, of despair, of things just getting worse and worse, of an invasive parasitic government that takes over private capital, and everything it does makes things worse, and when it makes things worse, it just does them again. Well, yeah, I mean, that does sound an awful lot like our world. So you could almost say that Ayn Rand had some amazing prophetic powers, that she's the conservative movement's own Nostradamus. So we ought to embrace her ideas. Now, we all, those of you who studied Ayn Rand's life know that the conservative movement has always loathed Ayn Rand. She is an atheist. The conservative movement is riddled with religious threads, so she's never been popular with conservatives. Well, it's politically expedient to bring her into the tent for a little while right now. We're going to talk in a minute about how that is actually a bit of a misreading of Rand. The world described in Atlas Shrugged talks about a lot more things than what's wrong with big government. It also talks a lot about what's wrong with big corporations. So we're going to get into all that. But on the surface, the narrative of the conservatives is actually very good. You read Atlas Shrugged, and I'm telling you, sometimes you just think like you're reading from today's headlines. One of the most memorable villains in Atlas Shrugged is a fellow named Wesley Mooch. Now, if you've seen the recent movie of Atlas Shrugged, they chose to pronounce his name Mouch. I just don't get that. I mean, when I read Atlas Shrugged for the first time in high school, it was definitely Mooch. Okay, so it's always going to be Mooch for me. We have our own real-world Wesley Mooch. His name is Barney Frank. Now, I don't normally use notes, and I apologize for waving these notes around, but I have them because I want to be able to make exact quotations without error here. You might remember that one of the refrains in Atlas Shrugged is every time Wesley Mooch did some ridiculous thing that made the economy even worse, he and his cronies would meet in Washington, and they'd say, "We need broader powers." Okay, we know government is the only enterprise that when it makes a mistake, repeats the mistake bigger. Well, let me quote Barney Frank. After the collapse of the U.S. housing industry and the U.S. mortgage industry, a collapse that more than any other single individual he engineered from his position in the U.S. Congress, getting Fannie and Freddie to loan money to and subsidize loans of money to people who couldn't possibly ever own a home, could never pay back the mortgages. That was all Barney Frank's work. When asked what we should do to clean up the mess, he said, quote unquote, "The way to cure that is to give us broader powers." You can't make this stuff up. But the amazing thing is Ayn Rand did 54 years ago. Frank is more like Mooch than you can imagine. Starting to get into the microstructure of Atlas Shrugged here, but you might remember that Mooch got into government in the first place. He started as a lobbyist. He was the lobbyist for Henry Reardon, who's one of the great heroes of Atlas Shrugged. He gets into government by betraying Reardon. Well, that's a certain kind of corruption. This is one of these things where when liberals are corrupt, it doesn't get very well reported. So you might be surprised to know that Barney Frank was censured by the Congress for a scandal in which he ended up admitting to have used male prostitutes and paid them and sustained them in his apartment in Washington as a base of operations for them. Did you know that as a member of Congress regulating Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, he placed one of his gay lovers as a financial analyst at Fannie Mae? Now, as a libertarian, I have no objection whatsoever to his sexual preferences. I have a serious objection to corruption. We're talking about a deeply, deeply corrupt man whose corruption very nearly destroyed the world. Another villain from Atlas Shrugged, alive and well in our world, is Alan Greenspan. Now, what character in Atlas Shrugged is Alan Greenspan like? Anybody remember Dr. Robert Statler? Kind of a minor character, but a very key character. He was one of two college professors who was a mentor to the young John Galt. And when Galt was still a young man, Statler left academia to found the State Science Institute so he could do his experimental physics, his theoretical physics, free of the grubby support of capitalists and people who pay tuition and things like that. And John Galt disowned him. He damned him. Now, at the climax of Atlas Shrugged, when the world finally totally goes down the drain, the climactic scene is when the government, having expropriated Dr. Statler's work in physics to create a weapon of mass destruction, this weapon actually almost accidentally detonates in Dr. Statler's presence, and the description of his death at the hands of this weapon that his science inadvertently created is one of the most moving passages in Atlas Shrugged. Alan Greenspan is Dr. Robert Statler. He is the most damned because he knew better. It's one thing to make these mistakes out of ignorance or pure power lust like Barney Frank did. Alan Greenspan knew better. Alan Greenspan, for 30 years, was a close associate, an apostle of Ayn Rand. He was with Ayn Rand the day she died in 1982. Best friends forever. He had no excuse. He knew better. When he first went to Washington in 1976 as President Gerald Ford's chairman of the Council of Economic Advisors, Ayn Rand and her husband Frank O'Connor were right there in the White House as he was sworn in by Gerald Ford. Why didn't Ayn Rand damn him? She actually said to the press that Alan is my man in Washington. Well, she didn't live long enough to see him become the chairman of the Federal Reserve. She probably thought then that he was sort of a double agent for capitalism, right in the heart of Washington. Well, it sounds good if you say it fast, but if any of you guys have ever spent any time in Washington, just the atmosphere there is an addictive drug. Washington is like an aquarium, but instead of being filled with water, it's filled with power. And after you've swum around in it for a while, you want more of it. And Alan Greenspan did. The Federal Reserve Chairman is the most highly empowered, most unaccountable economic czar on planet Earth. It's better than economic czar. It's master of the universe. And an Ayn Rand acolyte got that job. Well, the rest is history. It worked. He had an 18-year run as chairman. Seemed like it was okay for a while. A lot of bad things happened on his watch. It seemed he always bailed us out. I remember seeing him on the cover of Time magazine where the headline was, Chairman of the Save the World Committee. Well, I met Greenspan recently in Washington. Let me tell you what happens when you go into his office in Washington and meet Alan Greenspan. You see a shriveled little man who's wearing a sign saying, broken. He's 85 years old. His mind is still totally there. His spirit isn't there. He's a broken man. Look, I'd be broken too if I was hauled before Congressman Henry Waxman. You ever seen Henry Waxman? This guy looks like a combination of the original Phantom of the Opera with Lon Chaney Sr. and Mortimer Snerd. Waxman grilled Greenspan, got him to admit that all that self-interest stuff, all that virtue of selfishness stuff, all that individual self-interest, self-regulation stuff didn't really work very well in the credit crisis, did it? And Greenspan said, yeah, I guess it didn't work so well. He basically recanted. So when I met him, I said, did you really recant? I kind of saw it on YouTube. And he said, no, not at all. You completely misunderstood. That's completely taken out of context. Well, no, it's not. It's just like a year had passed. So I had my copy of You Like the Virtue of Selfishness. My favorite Ayn Rand nonfiction book is Capitalism, the Unknown Ideal, which has 2 chapters written by Alan Greenspan, one of which is called Gold and Political Freedom. And I have a first edition copy of that with Rand's signature on it, and I brought it with me to my meeting with Greenspan to get him to sign it. And I said, do you still stand by this? Should I be asking you to sign this? He said, every word. I stand by every word Ayn Rand ever said. I stand by every word I ever said for Ayn Rand. It's all stood the test of time. Well, just go to YouTube. That isn't what he said to Henry Waxman. So one of the lessons you can learn from Atlas Shrugged is if you don't want to end up being a broken man, have a little integrity. Stick by your guns.